So we've started off today by focusing on, what is the climate crisis? What is the science behind it? What's the measurement framework? And what does that mean in terms of emissions? We then started to look at, okay, we've got this new legislative regime in Australia that's established under the Corporations Act. And there's this mysterious AASB accounting standard. There's this Australian accounting standard on financial disclosures that we have to get to grips with. So we're going to focus on the first pillar of that reporting framework in this session this afternoon. So you'll remember, well, you may not remember. Let me remind you if you don't remember. The Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard, or the accounting standard that the Corporation Act refers you to, it's organised around four main pillars. So we've got governance and the disclosures that companies have to make on governance. We've got strategy and the disclosures companies have to make there. Likewise, risk management, what are the disclosures they have to make? And then finally, metrics and targets. So this session, we're just focusing on governance, the very first pillar, and we'll just talk through some of what's in the Australian accounting standards on governance and some of the disclosures that you're required to do. Next slide, please. So first of all, I think it's important to just start by stepping back and just having a little think about what is governance. I don't mind admitting that for a number of years when I was having to report into boards, it wasn't always entirely clear to me what they were asking or why they were asking things. And as I've had a couple of roles on boards myself now, I've started to get a bit better grasp on it. And really, it all sounds very dry. It's this, as Justice Neville Owen said in the HIEH Royal Commission, it's about rules, relationships, systems and processes, okay, in which authority is exercised, okay? So somebody exercises authority and these are the rules and regulations that go around it. It's the rules, regulations, systems and processes through which authority is exercised and controlled. So it's both giving of authority, but it's also control of authority. And with companies, that's particularly important because companies are made up of people and people need to be held account and entities need to be held account for their role in misdoing. So I think at the end of the day, governance is really about how is the system meant to operate and who and how are people held to account when things go wrong. So that's pretty dry. I think sometimes it's useful to step back and take a bit of a real world perspective on governance. Pop a thumbs up or a note in the chat if you don't mind. Who in this group works in an industry that's been affected by one of the major royal commissions? So maybe just give me a thumbs up. Okay, I'm guessing someone from banking. I think we've got someone from insurance here. Okay, so you maybe just pop a word in the chat for me then of what happens when governance goes bad. What are some of the impacts that you've seen in your in organisations that you may or may not have had associations with? What are some of the impacts that happens? People are really badly hurt. Okay, so we're not talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about people are really badly hurt. Any other examples that people want to pop in? You lose customers, people die in aged care. My goodness, that's, of course, we've had the Aged Care Royal Commission. I hadn't even thought of that, so thank you. So customers lose, I'm guessing that's probably your businesses lose their customers lose money. So governance is a serious thing, even though it seems pretty dry and it's about rules and regulations. At the end of the day, it's about people. It's about old people in nursing homes. It's about people whose life savings are in the bank, and it's about real world outcomes. So next slide, please. I thought it would be helpful just to have a bit of an open discussion about what happens when governance goes bad in a corporate setting, and just use an example that I'm hoping has nothing to do with anybody in this group. It's not a company, hopefully, that I think anybody here is actually representing today or from today. And of course, I'm talking about James Hardie. So the James Hardie case was very famous because it was about, can companies be held to account when they have falsely said they have set money aside for an asbestosis, basically health-related claims, and it turns out that those claims are in fact false. And I'll just give you a moment to just read that media clip for a moment. For those who, may be more or less familiar with this, basically, James Hardie was found responsible for the healthcare of people affected by asbestosis because the company itself knew and then didn't take the right action around the risks of asbestosis at the time. But one of the corporate governance fallouts was that the directors themselves were fined, disqualified from being company directors. And then, of course, the company itself had to stand up, I think it was a $4.5 billion fund to fund the medical costs of the people who are affected by that company's actions around asbestosis. So that's a case of governance that's gone bad. But I'm just curious, might be a bit of a leap in logic to shift from asbestosis to climate change, but what are some of the impacts do you think that might happen to the company or that might happen to customers if governance goes bad with climate governance? Just pop some ideas in the chat or raise your hand. I don't mind which you do. So just as a bit of a hint, the James Hardie case, okay, so fines. Yep, so the directors of your companies, they may get fined. Lose brand integrity, absolutely. Service disruption due to impact, yep. If everything burns down, you're not going to have a great electricity service. Greenwashing fines, loss of customer trust, supply chains disruption. Sites with patients may be isolated or flooded, get sued. Yep. Okay, so governance is really important. And the other specific link I would draw between the James Hardie case and what we're talking about today with climate reporting is that what James Hardie actually got in trouble for in this specific legal action was they'd made misleading statements in their reports. And it happens to be that the reports were about reports to the stock exchange, about a compensation fund. But of course, we're here today to talk all about climate reporting. So it's the same thing. And let me tell you, anybody who has done the AICD company directors course, anybody who sits on a board, anybody who has to sign over their life when you join a board, you live in fear of these kind of obligations. They really are. They sit with you very heavily. So the point I want to make is your company directors, your boards, which of course direct everything that you do in your company, they will care a lot about this reporting regime. So do not for a moment think that this will be dismissed. There might have been many things that have been done in your sustainability career that were not taken seriously or that were seen as a side issue. This is not one of them. This will be taken very, very seriously, and you should expect to get lots and lots and lots of questions about the content you put into your reports. And you can anticipate what some of those questions are just by understanding the governance obligations, which we'll go through in a minute. Next slide, please. Okay, so that little activity was really just about helping you understand the perspective of your board and why they care about this so much. They don't want to be in front of a royal commission. They don't want to get fined. They don't want to go to jail. They don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper. So why this is even possible is that these new climate relating obligations have been slotted into the Corporations Act, which is where directors' duties sit. So basically everything that we're talking about with these reporting requirements, they're now linked directly to the obligations that company directors have taken on as company directors. So it's really elevated the importance of this issue. So expect it to get high priority. And directors are going to have to make a declaration in signing off in the sustainability report that it complies with the climate reporting legislation, including this accounting standard. So once again, there's going to be a moment when somebody asks the director, are you willing to sign off on this? And it may go back and forward to the executive several times before it gets finalised, because this will be scrutinised very heavily before it's signed off. Next slide, please. Now, as we go through, feel free to drop in any questions. I'm very happy to be interrupted, and also to hear from you about your own experiences. So I like to get past alphabet soup and acronyms as much as I can. I personally, I'm just calling this AASB 2 standard. I'm just calling it the climate accounting standard, just as shorthand. So if you hear me talking about the climate accounting standard or the accounting standard, that's what I'm talking about. Because basically your job in compiling reports or in being part of compiling a report all stems from this accounting standard that tells you what needs to go into your sustainability report. There's a link there on the slides to where you can actually get a copy of the standard. And if you don't have a copy of it, I would suggest you hit on that and download a copy and put it somewhere, and at some point make the time to actually go through the standard. It's pretty dry reading, and I think it's about 30 or 40 pages, but it's important to sort of learn to navigate your way around it. So what I would observe about the structure of the accounting standard is there's the main body of the standard itself that sets out, okay, we're going to ask for disclosures around these 4 pillars of governance, strategy, risk, and metrics. But then there's all these attachments. One of the attachments gives you definitions for key terms, which of course is really important for understanding what you're reporting against. 2 of the attachments are about how you actually do things like climate scenarios and greenhouse gas measurements and so on and so forth. And there's better people than me to talk about that. But attachment D, which I've referred to here, I think it's really important because it sets out how you're expected to report. And so it's not just what you're expected to report, but it also speaks a lot to the quality of the information you're needing to provide. So for example, attachment D is where it sets out how to do your report, and it basically defines what's a useful report. And of course, your board is obligated to make a useful report. A useful report is one that is relevant and that faithfully represents what it purports to represent. So in other words, it has to be accurate. It needs to be complete. So it needs to present fairly all climate-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's prospects, meaning financial prospects. So again, it's not okay to just think you're going to get away with putting in a little bit of information but not really giving it all. Your directors will be at risk of personal liability if they're not making sure it's complete. And then just another keyword that I think is really important. In attachment D, you'll find there's actually a definition of what information is considered material. And it's pretty common sense, bearing in mind these disclosures are all about enabling general users to read these financial statements and to get a sense of how this company is governing and managing climate risk. Information is material if leaving it out or misstating it or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence decisions of primary users made on the basis of those reports. So in other words, if a bank looked at it and made a decision about whether or not they'd give you access to finance on the basis of it, and you'd left something out in that report and that would have influenced their decision, then you've left out material information, and that's a problem. So that's just a little bit around just the sort of basic structure of how you read through this 30-40 page accounting standard. Next slide, please. I'm somebody who I always like to come back to, what's the purpose of these reports? You know, why are we doing this? Well, so the legislative purpose is, these reports are for users of general purpose financial reports. Shareholders, banks, people investing, you know, people reading a set of financial statements at an annual report. So that's who these disclosures are for. That's your end users. And the purpose is so that, you know, if I go along to a Woolworths shareholder meeting and I'm a shareholder of Woolworths, I can open up the report and I can understand what Woolworths has put in place for its governance processes, controls and procedures to monitor, manage and oversee climate-related risks and opportunities. So I should be able to open up the annual report, see the sustainability section and understand, oh, this is how governance is done at this entity. You know, this is who's responsible, this is what their mandate is, this is how they factor in climate change risks and opportunities into decision making and so on. So that's, you know, so that's the sort of end user to keep in mind as you're thinking about preparing these reports. Next slide, please. Now there's a lot of detail in here, but basically, you know, we're here today to get across these disclosure requirements in the climate reporting regime. And insofar as they're about governance, there's two main aspects to this disclosures. One I would describe as being disclosures about the board and how the board does what it does in relation to climate change. And that's what we've got on this slide here, and I'll run through it. There's also another set of disclosures that have to be made in terms of management and how management of the company is involved in managing climate risk. So just starting here, we're talking about governance processes, controls and procedures the entity uses to monitor, manage, oversee climate-related risk and opportunity. So the first disclosure you have to make is, who is the body, whether that's your board or a committee, who is the body or individual charged by the entity with overseeing climate-related risk and opportunity. At the end of the day, it's who's responsible, who's accountable. So it's literally, it's not just, oh, X company takes this issue very seriously. It has to be Fiona David is responsible as the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, and she reports into the board, and you know, the board is ultimately responsible for climate risk and opportunity governance. So that's the first disclosure. But then you have to get even more specific. You need to be able to document how, if I'm the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee and I've got some responsibility for climate-related risks and opportunity, how is my mandate reflected in my terms of reference, in my committee description, in the policy that my committee is applying? So it's pretty serious stuff. And then how is the board determining that, you know, how did the board work out that Fiona David is the right person to have the appropriate skills and competencies to be thinking about climate risk and opportunity? You know, given that I might have been selected 10 years ago on the basis of my experience in as an accountant, you know, why is it that the board thinks that I'm the right person to be appointed for this incredibly important role? And then how often is the organisation reporting to me about climate risk and opportunity? So already they're asking for a level of detail that we haven't really had to provide before, and certainly not on a mandatory basis. One of the other really interesting disclosures is around how this body, you know, this chair of the board or this committee, how they take account of climate risks and opportunities in strategy, decisions on major transactions, and risk management, and including whether trade-offs are considered. So you can imagine a scenario where, let's say you're an energy company and you have to make a decision. Do you sell an asset? Do you keep the asset? Do you write off the asset? And that asset is, a very heavy carbon emitter. Then there should be some sort of written process or statement about how the board, how the person is going to take account of climate risks and opportunities when making those decisions. So again, it's not just we care about sustainability. It's okay, well, how do you take climate risk and opportunity into account when you're deciding what to do with this business development opportunity, or this major new joint venture that you're doing, or this major new investment. Finally, how is the board or the person with responsibility setting and monitoring targets? So it's not just what are the targets, it's how are you setting the targets? What's the process that the decision maker is going through? And how are these linked to remuneration policies? So is your executive, for example, is their pay linked to climate risk and opportunity? So it's pretty, for somebody who cares about climate change, it's actually pretty exciting. I think it's pretty exciting. I'm sure it's going to be very difficult for people to get this information together, but I'm really encouraged from that perspective of how do I have hope. I think this is a real step in the right direction in terms of making companies take this very, very seriously. So next slide, please. I've mentioned there's those two levels of there's the two types of governance disclosures. There's governance disclosures about what the board is doing, and then there's governance disclosures about management. And again here, where you're being asked to give very specific information. What is management's role in governance processes, controls and procedures to monitor, manage and oversee the entity's climate-related risks and opportunities? So what and whether roles have been delegated to specific management positions, or if there's specific committees, who oversees these committees and these positions, and what controls and procedures are they using and putting in place to support their oversight of climate risk. And also, interestingly, the standards want to know, are these processes integrated with other functions, or are they off to the side somewhere? And I suspect that for the first couple of years, they'll probably be a little bit off to the side, but increasingly you'll see this integrated into main business processes. Next slide, please. So, of course, we haven't had any reports under this new legislation yet. There are, of course, lots of organisations that have been doing voluntary reporting using different existing standards. Give me a thumbs up or something in the chat if your organisation has a voluntary report already. Have we got any entities that are already providing voluntary reports? Oh, we got one. I'm not sure if that's one or two or three. Okay, so we've got a few entities that have some experience providing this kind of level of detailed reporting, but probably under TCFD or other sort of acronym soup frameworks previously. So what I'm showing you here, I'm not saying this is right or best or good or even compliant. This is just an example of the sorts of, this is at its highest level what a visual representation might look like of governance. So you've got the board, you've got the committees, you've got you understand what they're responsible for, you understand how it flows through to the CEO and the management, you understand who within the senior management structure is responsible for which elements of strategy, embedding strategy, and then for risk and opportunity identification. So, and again, in the Woolworths report, this is also backed up with, I think about 4 pages of text. So this is just one extract, just to give you a sort of a bit of a visual idea of what I'm talking about. Next slide, please. I don't expect you to be able to read that. Again, it's just another example of visually, the sorts of things that you'll be asked to do is, describe that governance structure. There'll be a lot of words, but it'll probably also be helpful to have some visuals of what that governance structure looks like. And buried in the text in here, which I don't expect you to be able to read, but there's words like has a clear mandate as set out in the charter, which is available here. So readers, your general users of those stock plans financial reports, they can click through and they can actually see what is the charter of the Sustainability Committee. They can see who's on it. They can see it meets 4 times a year. And they can see that this is the committee that's responsible for working out ESG measurement, boundaries, targets, performance, governance, and independent assurance. Sorry, not insurance. So, there's other examples I could point to, but I do think it's just helpful to look at some of the prior reporting that's been done voluntarily to just get some ideas. So how do you set up an effective governance structure? You've got these obligations to report on certain things, but ultimately what you're actually after is effective governance, because you don't want to be in the James Hardie situation. You don't want to be in the Royal Commission with the aged care situation. Your entity ultimately wants to be a well-governed organisation financially, but also across climate risk and opportunity. So you'll see there the TCFD Good Practice Handbook. That's got some useful examples from overseas and different markets around what governance looks like in this context. And in terms of how that links back to your reporting obligations, we've just pulled out some of the key requirements that around you have to actually define the board roles. You have to establish mandates, establish reporting requirements and routines. If you've got subsidiaries, think about how you're ensuring reporting happens across lots of different entities. There's specific obligations there, as I've discussed, with skills and competency. So if your board, I know this is not necessarily something that everybody's able to influence, but if you're in a very senior management position, if there may be a need to offer education and skills training to your company directors or even to your senior leadership to make sure that they're able to sign off on those statements about why it is that these people have been given the climate responsibility. And set expectations around adequacy of skills. Now, of course, what sits behind all of this is resourcing. I haven't included that here because it's not necessarily part of the disclosure requirements, but I think it's pretty obvious that all of this is going to need resourcing. It's going to need, there'll be some, no doubt, learning over the next couple of years of how much resourcing, what resourcing it needs to actually get a quality report done. Next slide, please. So in terms of again, how do you think about those disclosure requirements and what's the practical action you might want to take? On the left-hand side there's 3 actions around very much, I guess, are very much directed at people who are engaging with the board. Maybe you've got a company secretary role, or maybe a very senior leadership position. The direction would need to come from the board, but ultimately management would need to do some sort of gap analysis of governance frameworks and make sure that it's meeting all of these new requirements, assess training needs. And then there's the really practical things like making sure that there's dates in the board's calendar for when regular climate updates get added. You can imagine that that's going to be new for a lot of boards. Internally, on the right-hand side there, establish a working group or a steering committee that has a formal policy, membership from across the organisation, reporting lines, processes for monitoring and executing action plans, oversight of the annual risk assessment, because as we've heard earlier from Louise, these processes are ultimately going to be audited. So, you need to have your own checks in place so that by the time it gets to the auditors, you're able to document everything. A process for annually measuring effectiveness. So there's a lot in there. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last one. Part of governance is being able to say, yes, we have a risk management framework. So, of course, this is something that's probably relevant to all of your roles and is possibly why you're here. You have some sort of connection, you have some sort of role in risk management, or you have some sort of role in leading a team in risk management. And critically, it's not just about having a risk management framework, it's about documenting, recording, tracking how the framework operates. It's about making sure that information from the risk process goes into those formal board level and senior executive level processes like the risk register, the audit and risk reporting. It might flow up through the organisation, get to the senior level executive, and then ultimately go through into the board papers. You'll need an audit trail. So again, how are you thinking about your systems and processes to be tracking this over time? How are you going to make sure that if material climate risks do eventuate, that there is some sort of system and process for senior management and the board to be alerted about those material risks? Because the last thing they want to find out about is that kind of risk after the fact. And then, of course, assigning responsibility, which is common sense for anything you're trying to operationalise. So, goodness me, I'm not going to say it's going to be easy. There's a lot in there, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how everyone's going as they sort of start to think through these issues. I've finished this session a little bit early, which gives us some time for questions, not only with me, but also with Louise, who was on the last session, if I might ask you to join me, Louise. I just wonder, has anybody, what questions are people finding coming up in their organisation? What challenges are they finding coming up in their organisation? And you don't have to say where you're from, I'm just curious, how is this rolling out in the real world? We already know that nobody in this cohort is feeling like they've completely got this perfectly nailed, so don't feel embarrassed. We've also got Ben backstage as well. Have we got any questions or any comments, any observations people want to make? We've got Louise here. Oh, thank you, Rose. So based on the pyramid graph, is it possible for the board committee and the group executive committee to be the same group of committee? So that's an interesting question. So I would imagine there would be some common representation. You would have someone from someone from across both of them, but yeah. So I think that is possible, but there would also be additional membership in the group executive committee would be what I would understand. Thank you, Belinda. That's very nice of you. It's been helpful so far. This is just the first pillar and it's already very comprehensive. Interesting. So it's difficult to get buy-in about this topic being mainstream and core to risk management beyond continuity planning. I'm interested to know if you're an organisation that is covered by the reporting obligations, because if you are, I think once your exec have gone through this reporting process, you will not have that difficulty getting buy-in. That's just my gut instinct. Addressing the complexity where the Australian reporting entity is non-listed but has a foreign-owned parent that is listed overseas. That's interesting. So what is the complexity that there's different legal regimes, Michael, that you're, perhaps linking into a European regime, or maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, Michael. So there's a question. I arrived a little bit late, so just wanting to check your understanding. Is there both an obligation under the Corporations Act to put in place X number of things on climate and then report on XYZ, and then the AASB says what needs to be in place? No, the Corporations Act is more along the lines of companies have to make financial disclosures and financial reports, and one of the reports that they now need to make is this sustainability report. But then all of the detail of what goes into that report is in this Australian accounting standards, the AASB. which is why it's so important to look at the accounting standards. Does the Sustainability Committee need to be countrywide in reference to consolidated statutory reporting members of the group, or can it have more of a divisional level? We have divisional sustainability boards, but nothing on a countrywide basis as there is little synergy. Okay, that's interesting. I don't necessarily have answers to these specific questions. Louise, do you have any thoughts that you want to offer on some of these? Some of these are observations and people, what we're all learning as we go. What are your thoughts?
Yes, look, I think there are some really interesting questions that we could definitely take offline as well. And I think it's really interesting seeing all the different scenarios that pop up in different businesses with different group structures, some with foreign parents and some with foreign subsidiaries. I think the overarching rule in terms of the Corps Act and whether you need to submit a sustainability report in Australia, irrespective of whether you have got a foreign parent entity, is to follow the same set of rules as if you need to submit a financial report under Chapter 2M of that Corporations Act. So if you are submitting your financial report under the Corporations Act, then you are highly likely going to be caught up in the sustainability reporting, and then you need to determine whether you form part of Group 1, 2, or 3 reporting entities in terms of the timing, based on those thresholds for each of those groups. So hopefully that makes a couple of those questions a little bit clearer around group structures and foreign group entities. Also, let's see what else.
I think another observation I'd make is that some of these questions I think are around what's the right structure in terms of how information and accountability flows through an organisation. And I think the answer is there's probably no one right answer for that, but what's clear is more the sort of the end goal you're after, which is that reporting is effective in that the right information gets to the right people, that there's clear accountability around decision making and who's ultimately held to account, and it's predictable and it's scalable for your situation. So that would be that would just be some thoughts. So it's less about you need to follow, for example, this particular triangle or any particular model, and more just about think about what's the purpose here. It's about getting the right, getting consideration of the right information by the right people at the right time with the right skills, the right competencies, and making sure all of that is tracked through the system.
Yeah, absolutely. I second that sentiment. I see there are a couple of comments as well about the magnitude of work that this is going to entail, and I suspect a lot of our attendees here are going to be the ones who actually have this on their plate. And how do we get this up the priority list and kind of higher up the agenda on our executives, everything that they are juggling and contemplating? How do we really just shift this as a priority, both at an executive level and I think a board level? I know this is something that people are battling with, especially the kind of Group 2 and 3 reporting entities where maybe they need to only start reporting in 2026 for the year ended 2027. It is a bit of a tricky one, but absolutely there is a lot of work to be done. I think a really effective way of trying to get it up on the agenda is around that education piece with your board and executive, making them really understand the implications of what this is going to entail, and that ultimately it should get the same focus as your financial report, because your board is going to have to sign off on your sustainability report the same way that they do your financial statements. And so it comes with, really similar consequences for them if it isn't prioritized. So I'm not sure if that education piece might help to shift it up the priority list. Another thing just to be mindful of is that the businesses that you might look to for consulting or for products to help you in the space, your audit firms who might help you, guide you with your sustainability reports for the first time, they are also all going to have a massively increased workload with this. So it's not only the workload that comes from within your organization, but also from a timing perspective to make sure that you are staging it long enough in advance of that first reporting period to make sure that you can access the help that you need externally to be able to deliver that sustainability report. So that might just be another way to get it up the agenda, to say we can't just click our fingers and expect people are going to be available to provide information to us or assist us with our whatever consulting we might need. Hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas. You're not the only ones having that challenge.
Louise, I can also see we've got a question in the Q&A from Jennifer Burton. Our organisation has never had to report publicly. We're a private entity in cohort 2. Where do we actually publish the disclosures? Is it just on the website or are they submitted to the regulator?
Yes, I can send you some information on that. There are guidelines in the Corporations Act about how and where to submit that. There is mention of publishing on your website, so submitting to the regulator as you would your financial statements and publishing on a company website. And there also are rules around putting it forward at the AGM if you have an AGM every year. So we can provide a link to where to find that information for you. I'm sure there will be others who find that useful as well.
And just to close this out, I think we've got a very astute observation here from Philip McKay. I feel we are all making this up as we go along, which is fine to get going on this. And I think that's absolutely true. So we've been given a bit of a rule book in terms of the accounting standard, and everybody's just going to have to it's going to be a bit of a muddle through the first time around, and that's why I believe there's the grace period in terms of the reporting that's in some of those time frameworks. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And I think there is, from regulators, there's the acknowledgement that this is a big deal. It is going to take a lot of work. They want to work with businesses to rather do it well and get started early, and rather than being too restrictive and bringing, fear of not getting it right the first time into play. So I think it is acknowledged by everyone out there that it's a big job on our hands, and there'll be a lot of learning, and there'll be a lot of tweaking and changing as you go along. So that's going to be a very natural part of the process.